Alright. With the Old Republic Annihilation, that's coming out next. And that'll be out November 13th. And it's going to star Theron Shan, who's not really a Sith or a Jedi. It's going to be a spy. Was that a decision on your part to do something different?
Yeah, having worked with Darth Bane and Revan, I've kind of covered the super powerful Force users. I kind of wanted to take a look at what it was like to write a character who didn't have those Force abilities. There's a lot of cool characters in Star Wars who aren't Jedi, who aren't powerful Force users. Of course, Han Solo's a lot of people's favorite character. He's actually one of my own personal favorites. And I wanted to see what it would be like to, write a tale of someone who's a hero, who's definitely, not your run-of-the-mill average person, but doesn't have these incredible Force abilities. So it was a conscious decision on my part.
And from the book's blurb, we know that one of the primary antagonists is going to be Darth Carrot, a female Sith. How will she be different from other Sith that we've seen?
Well, one of the interesting things about Carrot is she's coming into the Sith at a time when they're just sort of opening the doors to non-Sith and non-human species. So she's Faline, and bringing her in, she's kind of got to fight against that prejudice. So, as bad as it is for any Sith, watching the backstabbing and the treachery and the double-crossing, it's even worse for her. The other interesting thing about her is she is a disciple of, or following the footsteps of Darth Mekis from the Lost Sons comics. So a lot of what she does is integrating the organic abilities with the technology of the ship. She's got a very interesting relationship with the ship she controls. It's almost like they're sort of two parts of the same whole. So you'll see some kind of interesting cybernetic stuff going on there, which I think is kind of a unique take.
When you wrote the dialogue for Nos Durl, I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, Nos Durl, yeah.
Did you have Lance Henriksen's voice in your head when you did the dialogue?
Yeah, because Lance Henriksen did some of the voice work for us for the Old Republic. You kind of have to have his voice in your head. It's such a great voice. He's got such a great ability as a voice actor that it makes it very easy for me to imagine how he speaks and how he says things. And as a writer, that's great because you can get into the character so much easier when you have something like that to draw on.
Can we expect to see any HK droids in the story?
HK-47 is a character that a lot of people want to know what happened to him. And I think if we do get into that story, it's going to be his own book. We're going to focus on, the wild adventures of HK-47. Because I don't want to just sort of pop him in as a cameo. He is an interesting personality because he can take over a story very easily, So we have to be careful with him. So you won't see anything like that in this novel.
So you'd actually think about doing a novel from starring a droid?
You know what? I think it would be a lot of fun. There's no official plans right now, but,
'Cause I don't think we've ever seen that.
The fans seem to want it. It would be interesting because I don't know if we've ever really gotten a glimpse into sort of the inner workings of how droids think, all you ever see is sort of their output, how they process and spit it out. So I don't know if it would be possible to write it from his perspective or if he would just be sort of the main focus. It would be an interesting challenge.
I think they might have did it in the Tales of the Bounty Hunters with Forlorn, the one with Zuckuss.
Oh, they could have, yeah.
I don't know if they ever got to see in his head. I know we got dialogue from him. I don't remember if there's any.
But it'd be a fun challenge. I think that might be something to look into.
Working in the Tor period, what was one of the more interesting things about their Sith?
Well, the Tor era Sith, the Old Republic Sith as they are in the game and in the books, are sort of they're more than just a religious following. They're more than just a philosophical following. It's a whole culture. It's a mixture of the human and the pureblood Sith. They have a very interesting society, and it's very different from what you see in the movies. They're much more of almost a militaristic society. They've got a very strict hierarchy. Everybody is kind of been sort of indoctrinated into believing that you have to do your duty and you have to sacrifice for the greater good. So it's sort of this, I don't want to say exactly communist mentality, but it's a dictatorship where they've definitely got the people believing that, you know, the emperor's word is law, and, you know, people are willing to sacrifice themselves for the emperor. In theory, of course. In practice, people tend not to fall into line with things like that. So it made it very interesting to work with that.
Now, with Revan, one of the interesting things with that novel was that the ending wasn't a happy ending. We don't normally see that in Star Wars. Why'd you go that route with it?
Well, you know, the thing, I've had a lot of people comment on that. Obviously, a lot of people were shocked by the ending. I mean, we don't want to spoil too much just in case. But the thing about Revan is, I've always thought his story was a kind of a tragic story. That was sort of established when KOTOR 2, Sith Lords, came out, because Revan had, as that story explained, Revan had disappeared into the unknown regions, and no one had heard from him. So obviously something had gone wrong. If things were fine, people would have heard from him. He wouldn't have abandoned his friends and left them behind and not told them. Mm-hmm. So I think right from that, people should have known this is not a happy, you know, he's going to come back and everything will be fine type of story. That wasn't the tone they set, and I didn't think that was the tone that we wanted for that. The other thing is, it did allow me to, you know, sort of have that Empire Strikes Back kind of an ending, you know. There are some victories in there. It's not a complete defeat, but it's also not a complete victory, and it kind of lets you know there's sort of more to come. And, you know, some of his tale was continued in the MMO. And even there, they've left some doors open. You know, they haven't completely closed them. So, you know, Revan's a tale that may continue on. It just happens that we're in a very dark chapter.
That was the other part of my question. Do you think we'll ever get a happy ending for it?
You know, it's hard to say. It's possible. I know a lot of fans kind of want to see that. You know, anyone who's played the MMO knows he's kind of taken a strange journey since the novel. Things have happened, and in the game, certain things happen, and I don't know what the ultimate plans are for that. You know, it's one of those things that I think has to be approached very carefully, and I think some fans want it, but I also think it's the kind of thing you can't just slap a happy ending on just because you want to. It would feel awkward. So it's something we're gonna, you know, we're just gonna have to wait and see how that plays out.
The upcoming Annihilation, you're gonna write a spy. You've already done Revan as a Jedi. You've done Bane as a Sith. How would you challenge yourself next?
That's an interesting question. You know, I mean, I think, as we touched on earlier, the idea of a HK-47 droid would be a really interesting challenge. You know, it's hard to say because, you know, there is still, I think, stories to be told with, you know, Jedi and Sith and people with Force powers. And, you know, I even think a character like Theron Shan, he's a very interesting character, and there's more that can be done with him too. So at the moment, I'm not kind of looking around for like what's the next challenge. You know, I don't have a checklist. I'm not checking off. Okay, bounty hunter check. You know, smuggler check. You know, I'm not going through the class list and checking them off. But I think for now, you know, if Annihilation's well received, which I think it will be, I think fans are really going to enjoy it. You know, we just have a nice variety of types of characters that I can explore if the opportunity comes up.
Now, outside of Star Wars, you're working on a new original fantasy novel series, Children of Fire. I'm actually a huge fan of like different types of races and monsters that you see, you know, elves. Will we see anything like that in Children of Fire?
Children of Fire, there's a little bit of that, but you basically have two sort of cultures. You have the human culture, and you have the Danon, is what I'm calling them. And they're slightly different, but they have similar origins. They're almost a spin-off of the human species. I think a closer example would be something like George Martin's work, where it's not about necessarily different species, it's about the the different factions within the kingdom, within the realm, within the world, fighting for control. And for me, I kind of wanted to take it in that direction. That's just the type of story that it felt like to me. So I didn't necessarily want to go in sort of, the Tolkien-esque way of, you've got the elves, the dwarves, the orcs, the humans, each one represents their own thing. I have, different regions of the world where different cultures are prominent and different values and different characters that represent them. To give you a feel of how the world is. So I kind of took it in that direction.
Will it be a more realistic type of fantasy then? I mean, will there be less magical, mystical type elements?
The magic is an important part of it, but magic is pretty rare in the world. It's something that is considered quite dangerous by the Order, which is the group that controls and sort of the religious orthodoxy of the predominant culture. So they're constantly kind of, going on, for want of a better term, witch hunts, to find people who have these powers and sort of suppress it. So magic is important, but a lot of it is also about the sort of the gritty realism of people struggling to get through, these difficult times and these challenges. But magic definitely plays a very important role in the novel.
What would you say, like, the overall theme, like, the message you would like readers to take away from it would be?
I don't like to try and put necessarily messages in my books because I think there's a lot of value in just reading for entertainment. But I mean, for themes, there's themes that I return to quite a bit in my writing. People will recognize them. I like exploring sort of the nature and the allure of evil and how it can tempt you and how it can turn a good person down a dark path. I like to look at redemption is another theme that I'm very big on. And I definitely like to find, characters that people maybe have sort of mixed feelings towards. You like some of the things they do, some of the things you think are outside the bounds of what is acceptable, or maybe they aren't quite as heroic as they need to be. They have their flaws and they're real characters. So those are kind of some of the themes and style that I tend to return to in my writing. And you'll see a lot of that in Children of Fire.
Would you say it's more of a lighthearted or a darker type of story?
It's a bit dark. There's definitely a lot of, again, a theme I like is sacrifice, sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and sacrificing people who maybe don't deserve it. But it's a pretty dark series in some ways. Anyone who's read my Bane stuff, for example, or as you said, the Revan stuff, has gotten a glimpse of, I don't necessarily do the happy ending, even with some of my Mass Effect stuff. But I also don't believe in completely hopeless, bleak despair. I think it's okay to have some grim darkness, but you got to have some hope and some victory in there too. Otherwise, it's just depressing.
Going back to Star Wars, with the Sith Emperor, he's pretty powerful. You got somebody who, as a teenager, is conquering a world, is wiping out the Dark Council, almost achieving immortality. Going forward with Star Wars villains, would you want to see them being more powerful, not being as powerful as that?
I always kind of like to look at the progression of villains as not necessarily an increase in power, but an increase in sort of subtlety and effectiveness and methods. I think there's only a certain level of power you can't get above it. The Sith Emperor in the Tor series it's hard to imagine someone who gets more powerful than that. The Emperor in the movies, in the classic trilogy, is pretty powerful too. I mean, it's more hinted at than explicitly shown.
He's also more of a schemer.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's, people don't necessarily appreciate how powerful he is because the real trick is to not have to constantly use your full power. You need to, as you said, you need to scheme and plot and, manipulate people so that you're not constantly throwing around the world-destroying abilities. And I think that's sort of the progression you see. It's not that, they necessarily get stronger or have to necessarily top previous villains in sheer power. I think what you want to see is, their methods get more refined and more effective, and they do different things, and they kind of approach things in different ways.
When writing so many different Sith characters, how do you keep them fresh or unique? How do you make them stand out from each other?
For me, with Sith characters or any characters, I think the key is in the details. If you look at things in broad strokes, most characters will share a lot of sort of archetypal traits, not just in Star Wars, but everywhere. So where you find this sort of subtle differences is when you start to dig into them. Whether they've got certain doubts or what's driving them, what got them into, joining the Sith in the first place. What was their sort of expectations? And I think that's really sort of the thing you need to do as a writer, is just find those little details. Because when you describe something in vague terms, everything can sound similar, which is a little bit not fair to an artist, because it is really the details that make things interesting, memorable, and fun.
Now, in writing, what would you say comes easiest for you when doing the story? I mean, is it the story, developing characters?
For me, I think with writing, there's two things that I find very easy. One of them is just sort of come up with the overall plot. I work from pretty detailed outlines. I like to really plan things out, so the pieces fit together. I think people can kind of see that with my Bane series. I bring characters back, and I kind of lay the groundwork. So that sort of overall plotting is a big focus of mine. And I also enjoy writing sort of the action scenes. Where I struggle, and I'm sure people who read it will comment on this, but I struggle in things like description, describing sort of locations or characters, or that kind of thing is tough for me. I kind of, in my mind, have a very clear picture, but I don't want to bog the reader down, so I struggle to give them enough detail that they can form a clear picture without dragging the pace of the story down.
I'm not sure I've ever had a problem with that, seeing the imagery when I read your stories. It seems like I've always been able to picture it with the descriptions you've given. Well,
that's good. That means I've managed to pull it off, but I spend a lot of time on those. Those are the things that I spend the most time writing. It's just a slower process for me, and I have to redo it more often because, it just, for some reason, it doesn't come as naturally to me as some of the other stuff.
If George Lucas were to turn one of your books into a movie or a TV show, which one would you want it to be?
Wow. Honestly, any of them would make me just ecstatic. But I think just because it was my first one, I'd love him to take the Bane, the first Bane novel. I think it's a good type of story for a film. It's epic. It's got a good character arc. If you're listening, Mr. Lucas, I think it would work really well on the screen. But I think if I had one choice, I'd probably go with that one. It's my first novel, so it's always going to hold sort of a special place in my heart.
Anything else you'd like to add?
I think I'm grateful that I got a chance to do this interview and talk to your fans, and I think people are really going to enjoy Star Wars Annihilation. Anyone who's read any of my Mass Effect stuff has sort of seen a glimpse of how I handle characters, who don't have sort of the special powers. So I think you're going to find Theron Shan a very interesting character, and I hope people really enjoy Annihilation.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.